everyone. I'm your host Dave, and I hope that you've had a very merry holiday season, for whatever you celebrate. And welcome to the last review of Season 2 here on Zilog and Moto, before we wrap up with next week's second annual Year in Review video, where I look at the best and worst of Season 2 and the year 2020, and throw out some awards and best of lists based on all the games I've had the privilege of looking at over these first 96 episodes. Before I go too much further, for anyone confused by the last paragraph and who might be new to the channel, well, first, welcome to Zilog and Moto. On this channel, I'm on a journey to build a collection of every commercially available English language release for the Sega Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, and then play and review all of those games, so that these shells behind me don't just serve as some sort of emotionless monolith. Each of these games has a story, and I'm going to share that story with you once a week until I'm at retirement age. Hopefully. This week, I'm finishing out the Season 2 schedule with another Master System title, which unfortunately I've had to do a bit more of than I'd originally planned. However, that Master System library is a lot stronger than most people probably realize, or at least those of us in the United States anyway, just due to how many Master System games never saw the light of day on these shores. And the game of the week this week is yet another one of those titles in Pac-Mania. Now just about anyone, even those not well versed in arcade games, should be familiar with the game Pac-Man, which took the king of arcade's throne from Space Invaders starting in July of 1980 in Japan and then 5 months later in the United States. Pac-Man was a hugely popular game, getting ported to literally everything, including a notorious port to the Atari 2600, which I spent plenty of hours playing as a kid. With the popularity of Pac-Man, sequels were inevitable, and in an attempt to keep the arcade players coming while newer and different games hit the market. The problem was, with the exception of Miss Pac-Man, which is an improvement on the original in just about every way, these newer games were seen as a rehash of the original, even though at times they contained pretty different game mechanics. This continued on until 1984 when Namco decided to release Pac-Land, taking the series in a wildly different direction. Fast forward to 1987 and Namco had a brand new 16-bit arcade board platform that was beginning to release arcade cabinets around, and what better way to sell new arcade machines than create a new game around your most well-known character and mascot in Pac-Man. However, rather than follow up the Pac-Land offshoot, Pac-Mania was designed as a remastering, if you will, of the original game, with more colors, bigger mazes, more ghosts, and a high-tech 3D isometric graphic layout. Pac-Mania served to be a successful relaunch of the series in arcades, and while nothing could ever replicate the success of the original, or perhaps Miss Pac-Man, it did well enough to earn conversions on the usual suspect European 8 and 16-bit home computers like the Commodore, Amiga, Atari ST, Amstrad, and ZX Spectrum in 1988, but wouldn't start to appear on home consoles until 1990 due to Tengen holding the publishing rights. Finally, in mid-1991, both this Master System version and the Genesis version that we'll look at in about another 100 episodes or so would make their way to Sega's consoles. So, was Pac-Mania on the Master System worth the 4-year wait? Or is it definitely a case of too little, too late, giving the player ample reason to skip the title and play something else? Well, we'll take a look at all that, but first, a look at the package.
And here is Pac-Mania, in all of its 8-bit down-converted glory. One thing that you'll probably notice immediately is that nowhere on the cover is Tengen listed, which comes at a stark contrast to other Tengen releases we've looked at previously on the Genesis, like Road Blasters in episode 83, and Hard Driving in episode 43. Well, Tengen didn't act as a publisher in Europe, just in the United States and Japan, so instead Tengen licensed this title out to Tecmagic to release. You may remember Tecmagic as being the developer and publisher behind the utterly horrific Andre Agassi Tennis from episode 73, and if you don't, well, congratulations. This copy of Pac-Mania is in really good shape, and other than some very minor imperfections here and there, it's held up amazingly well. The hang tab is intact at the top of the case, and there's no sun bleaching or water damage anywhere to the inner cover. Can't ask for much better than that on a 30-year-old game. The front cover is pretty well designed, although to be fair, it would be more newsworthy if it wasn't, as both the Pac-Mania logo and the cover art come straight from the original arcade machine. So unless they decided to do their own thing, it would be pretty hard to screw up. I like how they still had the tag in the corner as to what type of game it was, although, come on, do we really need to know that Pac-Mania is an arcade game? And I know Sega had put it on the front cover, but taking this chunk out of the cover art for the licensing section is just obnoxious. Flipping over the back, and it's got the usual European design allowing for minimal flavor text so that they can include multiple languages, in this case 7. And while I certainly don't speak 7 languages, I can barely speak 1, as you know, I just happen to notice that while 6 of the languages have the same variation of the flavor text, the Dutch flavor text simply says, "Dutch instructions are supplied in packaging." Well, that definitely makes me want to play Pac-Mania if I'm Dutch, let me tell you. The rear cover also features 4 screenshots from the game, and while they certainly could have been a little clearer, they're not bad, and I like how there's pictures of 3 of the 4 different level types included, to drive home that if you weren't familiar with the arcade game, that this looks decidedly different than plain old Pac-Man. Also, one last thing, in the stats box it mentions that the game has 19 levels. If you ignore the secret bonus level, this is technically true, but keep in mind that a lot of those levels actually use the same repeated layouts, just with different sets of ghosts and other modifiers, so buyer beware. Opening the case up, and Pac-Mania has one of those white Master System labels that you only seem to see on European releases, which is pretty cool. The manual is the usual landscape Euro style as well, but it's presented in an unusual way. Normally the manual pages will be divided up so that there will be multiple languages saying the same thing on each page, but if you notice, the English language stands alone at the beginning. After that, then every 2 pages is split amongst the other 6 languages. I don't think I've seen a game split in styles like that before, so it's definitely interesting to see English given a priority like that. There's not a ton in here in the 2.5 pages dedicated to the English version, but then again, it's Pac-Mania, there's not exactly a ton to explain. More interesting to me is the ad for Populous before the rest of the languages. Seems like a bit of an odd place for that. Okay, that's the Master System package for Pac-Mania. Let's get to the game and see how it shapes up compared to the arcade version, and if it's worth giving a look. I mentioned earlier in the intro about how Pac-Mania comes from a long line of Pac-Man games, with most of them at the time falling into a similar pattern of overhead maze game, where you guide your character, sometimes Pac-Man, sometimes someone else, through said maze and around a map collecting items while attempting to stay alive by either grabbing power-ups around the map or simply avoiding enemies that are out to get you. And while the early games in the series certainly aren't the same, they're similar enough to where any skills you can learn for navigating these maze-type environments will at least carry over and be helpful in other titles. Pac-Mania operates in similar fashion. I mentioned earlier that I've spent many a night growing up playing the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man, and while it's got a deservedly poor reputation as a port of the arcade game, it's still Pac-Man. As far as Pac-Mania is concerned, despite the fact that it supposedly did well in the arcades in 1987, I don't recall ever playing the arcade version. In fact, I don't recall ever even seeing the arcade version, but more than likely I have and just don't remember, either at a mall arcade growing up or at Galloping Ghost. But even though I had never played the arcade version, or any other version for that matter, of Pac-Mania, as soon as I started to play the game, that old feeling came back of playing Pac-Man almost 35 years ago on that 2600. My reflexes certainly aren't what they used to be, but some of that muscle memory was still there, and while I was never any threat to someone like Billy Mitchell, playing Pac-Mania for the first time on the Master System felt a bit like slipping on an old glove. However, I'm probably getting ahead of myself a bit. Pac-Man, the original title, is known as a maze game. This is due to the fact that you're guiding your character from a top-down view through an on-screen maze, very similar to drawing a line through a maze on a page in an activity book. However, unlike those mazes in activity books, there's no way out of the maze or a specific path to follow. Instead, the goal in Pac-Man is to navigate your way through the maze in such a way so that you collect one of each pellet that is placed on the screen in the maze, with you determining how and in what order to do so. Making things difficult is the presence of 4 on-screen ghosts, Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde, who chase you around the maze in an effort to prevent you from collecting all the pellets, and advancing to the next level. To aid you in your quest to collect all the pellets, each screen also has 4 power pellets that allow you to turn the tables on the ghosts for a limited amount of time and chomp them instead, just like they were a pellet, clearing the way on the map and scoring extra points for you as well. Pac-Man certainly wasn't the only maze-type game ever released in the arcades, but the popularity of Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man definitely makes it the face of the genre, and certainly the most well-known examples, more so than other games in the series. And part of that is due to the fact that Pac-Man was just a great formula for a game, and Miss Pac-Man held to that same formula, tweaking it just slightly enough to make it stand out from the original. However, after Miss Pac-Man, the rest of the games in the series deviated pretty significantly from the original concept, while still remaining visually similar to the original titles, so gamers never really flocked to them. Why should they put in the time learning a new game when it looked like it was just the same thing warmed over? Namco recognized that people still loved the original Pac-Man, but knew that with it being 1987, there was no way a simple 2D top-down game was going to compete with other arcade hits, as it just didn't have the graphical horsepower to stand out in a room with other machines. So, using their current System 1 arcade board, Namco decided to go back to the Pac-Man well once more, but this time with a twist. They would use that newfound power of the System 1 board and instead recreate the classic Pac-Man experience, but in an isometric environment, giving the game a pseudo 3D feel. And I must say, if you look at the video of the original arcade game, Pac-Mania looks amazing, especially for 1987, with nice bright colors and a 3D look that appears to be a far higher resolution than you would expect. Fast forward 4 years to 1991, and finally we're at the focus of today's review, specifically the Master System port of Pac-Mania. By 1991, the Master System was dead and buried in the United States, but it was still thriving in Europe. Tengen, who held the console rights, saw that they couldn't make any money off of a Master System version, and handed the game off to TechMagic, a new developer that was creating the port of Pac-Mania as its first release ever. So already, you might assume that a Namco game licensed to Tengen, who then sub-licensed it to TechMagic to produce their first game ever, well, that might be a bit problematic. And it is, in places. The core of the original arcade machine is to guide Pac-Man through 4 types of levels, which start out with a brick maze that resembles giant Legos, then a few levels in a high-tech looking maze referred to as Pac-Man Park, a few more levels in an Egyptian-looking maze complete with sand and pyramids, and finally levels referred to as jungly steps, which I'm not sure why the word jungly is involved, but is certainly a bunch of connected stairs going up towards the top corner of the screen. The arcade machine allows you to start in each of the first 3 sections, offering bonus points if you're to start in either the park or sandbox land, due to skipping the earlier levels and rewarding you for jumping straight into a more difficult level. Think of it similar to how Road Blasters allows you to start on either the 1st, 4th, or 10th race, if that makes more sense. The Master System version fully replicates this experience with a similar set of levels to pass through and options for where to start. And as a cool bonus, there's also an extra hidden map added to the game that can be accessed from the first level, that's not in the arcade version. So points to TechMagic for going that extra mile and by adding that to the game. Where things pretty quickly start to fall apart are the graphics and sound. Starting with the graphics, as I said earlier, one of the cool things about Pac-Mania in the arcades was how good it looked for the time period, utilizing an early 16-bit arcade board to power its display. The Master System is of course an 8-bit console, so you can imagine TechMagic was already behind the 8-ball a bit regarding the port, as there was no way the Master System was going to be able to accurately replicate the game. Or was there? Keep in mind that even though the Master System was an 8-bit console, its strength is in its graphics capabilities compared to other 8-bit consoles and computers. And Pac-Mania wasn't just spit out for a quick buck a few months after its arcade debut, it was developed 4 years later. To be clear, I'm not sure I'd say Pac-Mania looks bad on the Master System, specifically, but it definitely pales in comparison to the arcade original, and to add insult to injury, it's not even as good as the NES version from the year before. And we've seen on this channel before, when comparing the NES version of a game to the Master System version, the Master System version has historically been better, just due to the technological differences between the two systems, but that clearly is not the case here. And while I hesitate to say Pac-Mania on the Master System looks bad, I won't do the same for its audio. Simply put, the audio on the Master System version sucks. Sound effects are okay, the few that there are, but the classic Pac-Man alarm that sounds once you've grabbed a power pellet is gone, and it's really odd to not have that in there. As far as the background music goes, it's terrible. It wouldn't be so bad, and they did make an attempt to translate the music from the arcade machine, but most of the songs have a repetitive snare sound that just constantly clicks as you move around the map, similar to what I would think a click track would sound like for musicians to play in the studio to make sure they're in time. However, those click tracks aren't actually to be heard in the final product for a reason, and it's a relief when you play a level that doesn't feature that particular sample played. So, what gives? Well, it seems like that even though Pac-Mania wasn't rushed to the market to coincide with the arcade release, it's still a budget title. The Master System version only weighs in at 1 megabit, pretty small by 1991 standards. And I get it, it's not a super complicated game, but come on. They could have easily made this a 2 megabit game and had better graphics and sound. Just an absolutely lazy decision on TechMagic's part, but it does line up with my experience playing Andre Agassi Tennis earlier this year. While the graphics and sound don't appear up to snuff, I can at least report that the gameplay has been properly translated over. I mentioned earlier that playing Pac-Mania feels like slipping on an old glove, and having said that, it does play remarkably well. It feels exactly what I would expect Pac-Mania to feel like, with tight controls and no oddities or glitches. One of the main things that Pac-Mania introduced to the mix was the ability to jump over ghosts and to avoid them, and hitting one of those jumps always feels quite satisfying. Pac-Mania also introduced power-ups to the game that are interspersed with the fruit/food drops, such as speeding up Pac-Man, and those all appear to work as expected, which is nice and definitely a good addition to the Pac-Man formula. All in all, and this is something I had to think about for a bit, I'm giving Pac-Mania for the Master System only 1 star. I was originally planning on giving it 2 stars, as it is a proper port of the arcade machine and does give you Pac-Mania on the Master System, but the poor audio is very annoying, and once I saw how the NES version looked in comparison, that sealed it, as I know the Master System is capable of more. Perhaps throw in an extra half star if you're a Pac-Man fan, but we don't do half stars here.
And my friends, with that review of Pac-Mania for the Master System, the last Zilog and Moto review of Season 2 and calendar year 2020 is behind us. 2020 has sucked for a lot of reasons, as you're probably well aware, but I'm hopeful, personally and professionally, 2021 will be a better year for everyone. Hell, how could it be worse? Don't answer that. In the next few days, just after New Year's, keep an eye out for the second annual yearly recap show for Zilog and Moto, where I go over the best and worst of this last year, throw out some channel stats, and maybe read off a few top 10 lists, because everyone loves those, right? Or at least the search engines seem to think so. I've really enjoyed watching this channel grow over the last year, and I hope you all stay with me next year as I continue to crank out the retro Sega reviews and maybe work in some new old games like Coffee Crisis from earlier this year. Paprium has to be on the horizon somewhere, if I can make work on my Genesis, that is. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.